There's a quote claimed to be written by French philosopher Voltaire. Like so many great lines, many question who wrote them. But regardless of who did, this one has rung true throughout the centuries. Voltaire lived at a time of rapid social, political, and technological change. Enlightenment, as it was termed, changed how people thought they could live their lives. The personal freedoms he wrote about, the expansion of what humans could do and that they dreamt of, are now something we all take for granted. The saying goes, history never repeats itself, man always does. Now I want you to hold on to that phrase because across the episode, as we twist and turn through historical similarities, new information and scary propositions, remember that history never repeats itself, man always does. I'm Lachlan Gazzelli, this is Leave It to the Experts. "110 years ago, 1914, the heir of the Austro-Hungarian Empire is killed in Sarajevo. Worried about the fallout of what happens next, the Austro-Hungarian ally Germany thinks Russia's about to invade, so it triggers a plan to take out France before the Russians arrive in the east. Marching on Paris via Belgium, a nation protected by the British, Germany now brings the world's largest empire into the war. Soon enough, war breaks out across the globe, with fighting in the Pacific colonies and in Africa. Archduke Franz Ferdinand died on the 28th of June. By August, the German army had swept across much of France and Belgium. By Christmas, the war had virtually stopped along the Western Front and would sit in relative stagnation until its end in November 1918. However, in 6 months, the world had gone from surging through a wave of globalisation to being stuck in the mud of a bleak, hyper-violent, almost pointless war. 16 million people died during the fight, millions more injured, and the ripple from the stone of war cast into the pool of Europe's rapidly changing cast of war-hungry nations that rise and fall across the centuries is still being felt today. The relevance here is that many claim most nations didn't want the Great War. There was no burning issue that needed to be settled with a fight. Many premeditated the response of their enemies and essentially found no better solution. In fact, many nations on the continent had spent the past few decades looking inward, fighting for independence from monarchies, overturning the rules of kings and queens, and delivering democracies to their people. The big empires of the time, such as the British and the French, had just spent the past 50 years slicing up Africa with the Germans and the Portuguese. They were enjoying the spoils of enormous trade from faraway places once more. But just like that, in a few months, the world had slipped off the cliff into a global conflict, leaving millions dead. Again, another war that finished almost 80 years ago. In 1939, Adolf Hitler took part of Czechoslovakia for what he called his growing German Reich. Already, he had absorbed Austria into his borders, and he now threatened those with France, Poland, and all around him, claiming to free Germans being held captive by the deal struck at the end of a great war 2 decades earlier. Who does that sound like? The British, after allowing their armed forces to wilt and wane following the Great Depression, were unprepared. They dispatched Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain to meet Hitler. At a conference in Munich between the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, Adolf Hitler, and the British and French Prime Ministers, they agreed to allow Germany to take part of Czechoslovakia, known as the Sudetenland. The Czech government weren't even invited to the meeting.
The settlement of the Czechoslovakian problem only the prelude to a larger settlement in which all Europe may find peace.
The British and the French chose to appease Adolf Hitler. They decided to allow him to self-regulate his expansion across Europe, choosing to believe that war could be avoided if he just did what the aggressor wanted. By the end of the war, an estimated 3% of the global population was killed, almost 80 million people. So what's the lesson from this? Could war have been avoided? Potentially not. But the big powers creating problems, choosing self-interest over global peace, and then leaving smaller nations in the middle to fend for themselves, is just another lesson it appears our politicians have failed to learn.
The Russian president says a military operation is now underway in eastern Ukraine. Ukraine has declared a state of emergency.
The full-scale invasion that intelligence officials had been warning about for weeks is now underway.
Or to put it more articulately, history never repeats itself, man always does. The war in Ukraine is in relative stagnation. After huge surges in its first year from both invading forces and Ukrainian defenders, it has achieved very little. In the 1,000 days since the invasion, 1/5 of Ukrainian territory is in Russian hands. It has been around that number since February of 2022 when the invasion began. Russia has superior firepower and manpower, and it also now has the backing of its allies on the battlefield.
North Korea is sending troops to fight with Russia in Ukraine.
The human cost of the war is enormous. More than 1,500 Russian soldiers were killed or wounded every day in October, while the damage of Russian missiles is not only felt by Ukrainian forces, but its civilians too.
Civilian casualties continue to mount as Russian forces intensify attacks across the country. Kyiv says Moscow has fired 130 missiles.
However, the fight, which became almost forgotten about in among the potential of an all-out war in the Middle East and fighting in the occupied Palestinian territories, it has now gained new momentum since the election of Donald Trump.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
The incoming US president says he will end the war in Ukraine. Both parties want the fight to end, but neither is willing to take a backward step. Trump's isolationist allies in US Congress want the United States to retreat from its enormous funding of Ukraine's defense.
I'm sorry, Ukraine is not the 51st state of the United States.
No, but is it
I've looked. I cannot find anywhere where Putin says he wants to invade Poland.
But what will this mean for Ukraine? Will this curb Vladimir Putin's civilizational urge to dominate all nations who have a history with Russia? What does America pulling out its billions in funding and weaponry do to a nation like Ukraine? Let's look at recent conflicts for some kind of clue. Trump's negotiations with the Taliban ahead of the Biden administration's exit from Afghanistan sealed the country's fate. The government the US had spent decades building and funding ultimately failed, with many of its corrupt leaders fleeing the country as the Taliban entered Kabul. In Iraq, the power vacuum the Americans created in destroying the regime of Saddam Hussein set the nation on a path of warlords, militias, and paved the way for ISIS to take large territory before peeling it back in the years to come. Across the decades, the Americans fought bitterly in Vietnam until they deemed the cost too much and left the South Vietnamese to fend for themselves briefly before they were taken over by the communist North. Much like how the British left the Czech government out of the room as it gave away parts of its land to Nazi Germany. So will the American administration heed the warnings of history? It appears that Joe Biden's team don't believe they will, which is why the Americans and their allies have attempted to reshape the war in the final days of 2024.
The US President Joe Biden has authorized Ukraine to use American long-range missiles to strike targets deep inside Russia.
In an attempt to put Ukraine in the best position ahead of a Trump presidency, the United States has deployed an arsenal of medium-range ballistic missiles that Ukraine is now using. These missiles can reach up to 300 kilometres inside of Russia, pushing back troop deployments, building at the border, fracturing supply lines unimpeded through the war so far. French and British governments are too offering up their equivalent systems, offering Ukraine a way to reshape its war. Russia's response is straight from the historic playbook.
Long-range attacks came as Russian President Vladimir Putin approved an updated nuclear doctrine, which says Moscow could consider using nuclear weapons if it was subject to a conventional missile or long-range drone assault supported by a nuclear power.
Vladimir Putin says that Russia now perceives any use of a nation's weaponry on Russian sovereign territory as a threat befitting of a nuclear response, and showed it its intent straight away.
After Russia raised the stakes in the war against Ukraine by firing an experimental ballistic missile, Ukraine says the missile flew for 15 minutes at Mach 11.
The use of new experimental weapons by Russia, signalling a willingness to execute any plan it deems necessary to win the war in Ukraine, now includes the potential of a nuclear threat. The world has danced on the blade of the nuclear weapons debate for decades. The United States and the Soviets, the United States and the Russians. The colours and the names change, but the debate is all too familiar to the history billions have already experienced in the 20th century. The nuclear threat has been a constant in the war in Ukraine.
Nuclear saber rattling from the Kremlin this morning, with Vladimir Putin appearing to threaten to use nuclear weapons if Ukraine fires American-made missiles into Russia.
Some believe that Putin uses this as a strategy, that the use of nuclear threats weakens the resolve of the West to continue the fight for Ukraine. The experts at the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, home to the famed Doomsday Clock, said at the start of the year that in 2024, ominous trends continue to point the world toward global catastrophe. During his last administration, Trump was believed to be coercing the Ukrainian government to back an investigation into the son of his political opponent, Joe Biden.
And they're always saying the same thing. President Trump made a totally unsubstantiated claim about Hunter Biden and his father. It's not unsubstantiated, you crooked son of a guns. It's 100% true.
With Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky caught in the middle of the Trump media complex. The reality is that the Americans and its European allies do not want for a war with Russia over Ukraine, much the same as the Iranians do not want a war with Israel over the Palestinians. However, in this time of avoiding the aggressors of the region, the potential for all-out conflict only increases. Placating Vladimir Putin in Ukraine, as it is believed the new American president might do, would see Putin's stagnating war rewarded with new territories. But will that be enough to satisfy his imperialist ambitions? The echoes of history ring louder as the war enters a new period ahead of Donald Trump's ascendancy to the White House once again. This new era is one of hyper-speed, getting done what you can before power changes hands, preparing a position to negotiate from when the self-appointed doyen of deal-making re-enters the conversation. As the world enters this new phase of the war, it is through history that we can analyse what happens next. It is through our shared failures as warring nations over centuries that can offer us the lessons we require to ensure that if this war stops, it must not sow the seeds of the next one. Or are we bound to replay the 20th century once again in an endless loop where history may never repeat itself, but you can rest assured that man always will? We'll be right back.
Hi, my name is Andrew Jaspin, and I'm the founding editor and director of 360 Info. At 360 Info, we're providing evidence-driven, solution-based journalism, all written by leading experts. Every week, we release new and innovative news content that bridges the gap between the world's brightest minds and the global public. To be part of the fight against misinformation, sign up for our newsletters and follow us on social media, or head to 360info.org. If you're a journalist or a publisher or editor, you can sign up for our Newswire service, which is free of charge at newshub.360info.org.
So just how will the war in Ukraine reshape itself ahead of 2025, and how close to the unthinkable a nuclear war could we be? Let's ask our expert.
I'm James Der Derian. I'm the director of the Center for International Security Studies here at the University of Sydney. And I'm also a documentary filmmaker working really at the interface between technology and geopolitics.
James, this phase of the Ukraine war has been going now for over 1,000 days, with fighting going on since 2014 in the east. In that time, we've seen, since the early days of the full Russian invasion, a relative stagnation. Fighting confined primarily to the east of Ukraine. What are the realistic expectations of any peace deal when neither side is willing to give in, despite ultimately returning to the same position?
It's the beginning of the end of the war, and that both sides realize the game plan is going to change with the regime change in the United States. Trump does need a win immediately, quickly. He's billed this as one of his strong suits, personal, transactional foreign policy, particularly with other global leaders that he sees as his peers, Putin, Xi, and others. I think this is going to be why we're going to see compressed amount of violence in a short, spell between now and January, and each side trying to regain some territory and possibly negate the gains that were, potential gains of bringing North Korea into the conflict. So I'm more concerned now than I was perhaps at any moment, except from when the last time it looked like Russia was on its heels and it threatened to use tactical nuclear warheads, and the U.S. issued a very, very strong, stern warning about that use. I think we're back at that moment where if there are breakthroughs, we could see some potentially very risky maneuvers by either side.
Now, the usage of these US as well as French and British mid-range missile systems has seen the Russians claim that it has crossed a line which warrants the use of, or the potential use of, nuclear weapons. How much of this is just bluster and utilising that so-called madman theory from Richard Nixon's days, where leaders use the threat of nuclear war to scare an opponent to get their way?
Well, there is a ladder of weapons choices, and you start at the bottom, tactical, and this has been part of warfighting doctrines on both sides for a very long time, from the Cold War days of NATO, where the superior Soviet forces would justify in the minds of NATO wargamers the use of tactical nuclear warheads by NATO, meaning there was a first use policy. There have been other historical crises that have been very close. One of the most famous is Able Archer in 1983. President Reagan had come into power and said he was going to relegate Marxist-Leninism to the dust heap of history, and that triggered a lot of paranoia. It doesn't take much to do that when you have an octogenarian leadership, Andropov, who had never been to the West and didn't know any of the people, and his experience is based out of Russia having been invaded before, or twice, and also there'd been the shooting down of the KAL 007 airplane and over the skies of South Korea. Things were really on a knife edge. And then what does NATO do? It holds its first nuclear war game in 1983. And they actually bring out nuclear weapons and attach them to airplanes. Already, thanks to what was called Operation Ryan in the Soviet Union, they were attuned to possible use of a war game as a ruse to start a war, to hide behind the war game, to undertake a preemptive attack on Russia. And they believed it. They thought this is it. And they went up to their equivalent of DEFCON 1, where you're on, basically a hair trigger. And thank God we had, at the time, actually, Britain really was in charge of this, a double agent in Kremlin who said, listen, they think this is real. His name was Oleg Gordievsky, and he later defected. And I had the pleasure of meeting Gordievsky at a conference very early after he defected, and he told me just how close this got. And he said it was closer than the Cuban Missile Crisis, which that's pretty frightening.
Most people today, their understanding of things like Able Archer or the Cuban Missile Crisis comes from movies and TV shows, usually featuring Kevin Costner. But I've read comments from former US Secretary of State Robert McNamara saying when he spoke to Fidel Castro decades after the Cuban Missile Crisis, that he didn't realize himself just how close they were to nuclear war. In a world that's flooded by media and which are heralding the new worst possible thing, how do we prioritize this nuclear threat, this particular one? And, what have we learned from the past?
Well, that's the $1,000 question, really, because, do we learn from history, and which histories? You referred to this moment where Fidel Castro and McNamara have this sort of, revelation, road to Damascus, like, how close they got. And that was when I was, prior to my coming to Sydney, I was at Brown University, where that's where that was staged. It's the critical oral histories, where they triangulate, get all these leaders in one room, get the documents, and force them to challenge, their assumptions about, what happened then, and what could have happened, that could have been worse, and how do we prevent that from happening again? And that's a lesson that, I criticize my fellow political scientists, but I think history is our most important laboratory here for understanding how people stumble into war. No one goes to war thinking they're going to lose. No one goes into war thinking that they're going to emerge less than victorious. And I mean, this is a misconception that of the leaders who take us to war, but also of the forces driving us towards war. Patriotism run amok. we're approaching a moment like that in the United States. You just can't turn on and turn off, patriotism or nationalism, hyper-nationalism. And the same with Putin in Russia. He heavily relies on an ideology of nationalism backed by this sort of idea of greater Russia and backed by the Orthodox Church. And these are all combining now in a historical moment that is a good reason to be alarmed. I'm not generally the type, I think we always have to prepare for the worst and hope for the best. But in this case, there are two world leaders now who claim to be buddies, but you can be sure that when it comes to national interest, that friendship will be tested early on. I think I very much hope that in the next few months that other powers, neutral powers or relatively neutral powers, can help bring people to the table, in Geneva, perhaps, somewhere where they can get around the table, talk about this without the, 30-second warning that comes with, a crisis situation. How do you respond?
There's been so much media reporting, and they narrow in on this phrase of sleepwalking into nuclear war, like we don't know what's about to happen. But realistically, how do we know one's on its way? Is this idea of mutually assured destruction enough of a deterrent to stop it, or is this something we really need to talk about more?
Well, to unpack that, there are strategic doctrines for the use of nuclear weapons. The so-called flexible response, where you start off at the bottom and escalates. That assumes that at each one of those rungs of the ladder, that world leaders and generals will have the wherewithal, meaning communication systems are still intact. They're not operating out of fear and terror. That they are responding based on misperceptions. That, all these things that do happen in the fog of war. A very good documentary, by the way, by Earl Morris about this very situation where he interviews McNamara on these issues about flexible response. And McNamara admitted in this documentary that, we had the best and the brightest from Harvard telling us, we can escalate and stop. And he said that wasn't what happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis. People were making mistakes. Basically, the word had come out from, the president, Kennedy, that do not use depth charges to bring up submarines. They were used. Khrushchev had told Castro, do not fire on U-2 overflights. He did. And McNamara was told by his intelligence that there weren't nuclear warheads already in Cuba. And there were. So that if it had been the invasion that all his generals were advocating at the time, airstrikes and invasions, in the beginning of those, 13 days of crisis, there would have been nuclear war, but Kennedy stepped back. Maybe it helped that he was reading, about World War I and how we stumbled into the First World War. Barbara Tuchman's famous book about, the guns of August. He had just read that and sobered him up. And similarly, Reagan, believe it or not, it was watching a docudrama the day after of what would happen in a nuclear attack in one city in the Midwest that gave him cause to say, I have to meet Gorbachev. We have to talk about this. And also the after effect of Abel Archer, where he'd seen the intelligence. And for the first time, he refused to participate in any of the nuclear exercises or briefings, because he said, well, it'll just be Armageddon. I don't want to hear about that. But when he went through one of those exercises and he saw what could happen, that's when he decided to sit down with Gorbachev in Reykjavik, and then they hammered out the Intermediate Nuclear Missile Force Agreement that caused this sort of withdrawal and this sort of knife edge of nuclear deterrence that also meant that you had a higher likelihood of there being accidents and miscalculations.
I'd like your thoughts on the position of Europe in this, not just through arming Ukraine, but culturally, if they're prepared for an expansion of Russia's war goals. You see citizens in places like Estonia training for war, with Scandinavian nations joining NATO for added protection. If you were sitting in, say, Tallinn or Helsinki, how worried are you?
I would be concerned because there is a history. There's also a Russian-speaking minority, which is often used as a justification by Russia to protect its own in these countries, justifying hybrid war, but also in potential invasion. There's a submarine base on the other side of Lithuania, so I'd be a little bit concerned too if I was in Vilnius. There's a big Russian-speaking minority in Latvia, so all of the Baltic countries, and I'm always looking for signs of how serious we should take that. And one is that Finland, Norway, and I believe also Sweden have just issued for the first time very high level civil defense warning to all of its citizens. Have 3 days prepared of food and water and be self-sufficient, resilient, because something could happen. So that's, to me, the next potential flashpoint. I can just tell you by anecdotally, just shortly after the Soviet Union fell, a couple of years, and I was asked to go teach in Vilnius, and it was people from all the different republics who did international relations, and it was a really interesting experience. And I probably learned as much as they did from me trying to impart, North American IR after they've been learning Marxist-Leninism, international relations for a long time. But I took the occasion to interview the ambassador, the Russian ambassador in Vilnius, and he was an incredibly cosmopolitan man, very, very learned. We had a very good conversation about changes, regime changes, and threats, and he just said, if these countries join, NATO, that would be the red line for Russia. I've never forgotten that warning. And for Putin, he's always remembered as a former KGB agent who'd been stationed, in East Germany, that the encroachment of NATO, in his view, has been his justification. And so it's why I think the Baltic countries are concerned, in Poland right now too, and why, if this becomes just simply a giveaway by the next president of the United States, you can be sure you're going to see an intensification of provocation on those borders as well.
My final question is, as we head into 2025, you're somebody that works on the impacts of technology and the interaction that technologies have with international relations. How do you see it intersecting with these intractable problems? Is it the next crisis, or does it have the potential to unpick them, as we haven't been able to solve them over the past few hundred years, with the same way of thinking?
Well, history here provides some lessons. I mean, we wouldn't have had the atomic bomb if it wasn't for quantum mechanics. It explained fission, and indeed many of the first, great thinkers of quantum mechanics ended up being involved in the Manhattan Project. You could talk about the second quantum revolution, which was, the information revolution, because it really, you wouldn't have semiconductors without the principles of, quantum mechanics. And I think it's I don't want to hype it, but we do, one of the problems of the first two quantum revolutions is we weren't really ready for the geopolitical implications. Einstein famously said the atomic weapons changed everything except our ways of thinking. So when I talk about quantum here, I'm talking about not just simply the technological disruptions, the geopolitical implications, but how our ways of thinking have to change. Why I think it's important to get the third quantum revolution right before it actually happens, and I think it will happen. There will be these great asymmetries again. Who has it? Who doesn't have it? Who has the ability to decrypt every single internet message that's based on prime numbers? It can do simulations better than any classical computer. The greatest fear as well is that it'll be weaponized. We can't even begin to imagine, like every new technology, how they become weaponized. So the reason why I turn to these quantum innovations, because I don't think anybody was taking them very seriously in the political science area. They were certainly in all the physics departments, which are getting enormous resources for the next quantum, leap, if you want to call it that. And so I think it's the responsibility of, disciplines outside the sciences to talk about, what should be the norms, the guidelines. Do we need a Geneva Accord for the next quantum revolution? luckily, our own, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade has been concerned about this, and others in the Australian government. And thankfully, we've been funded by them and Carnegie Corporation to look into this issue. But I would just end on a hopeful note that also quantum gives us a way out. When it looks at the world in a holistic way, we're all entangled. There's not binaries. There's not good, bad. It's the negotiation of all these potentialities in humankind that gives me hope. But we have to get out of the old Newtonian models that think that everything is simply cause and effect and reaction, action, and states are just billiard balls bouncing off each other. States are people, and people interrelate. And we're now more entangled thanks to social media, internet, and the power of affect, of emotions now has been force multiplied. And we've got to get that right. Stop thinking about potentialities of nuclear war strictly as rational choice. It's not. It's going to be clouded by human judgment, technological, vulnerabilities, cascading effects, things that can get out of human control very fast. And one reason why we don't want to put this all in the hands of some super AI, you have to have humans in the decision-making loop, and you got to give them enough time to deliberate. And that's my greatest fear, is that, if you put all these, missiles on the borders, you have faster delivery systems, you have quicker, response times. Reagan was complaining about having maybe 6 minutes to make a decision, back in the 80s. Now we're lucky if it's 30 seconds. So that's the sobering question that we have to face now, is put in these safeguards now, these circuit breakers now, so we can move that nuclear clock you mentioned at the beginning of this back from that 90 seconds to midnight, back to something a little bit more hopeful, like, give us at least 5 minutes to midnight, okay?
Well, how fitting that we might require a computer to let us understand that we have a shared humanity with other people across the globe. But anyway, thanks very much for talking to me, James. It's been a pleasure.
My pleasure.
That's it for this episode of Leave It to the Experts. Head to 360info.org if you want to sign up to our newsletters and Newswire for journalists and understand our work to fight against misinformation with university experts worldwide. This episode of Leave It to the Experts was produced by Michael Joyner and Lachlan Gazelli. Music by Jan Skubieski at Red Moon Studios. See you next time.